We're asking officials from the Department for Education today how well they think it's going in targeting their support for schools for catch-up, and what the other wider issues are that they're having to support children on, and particularly disadvantaged pupils, as they seek, and we all seek, we hope, to see a turbocharge of catch-up to make sure pupils are not left behind. So I would like very much to welcome our witnesses today. We have Susan Acland-Hood, of course, the Permanent Secretary at the Department, Andrew McCully, who's the Director General for the Schools Group, and Graham Archer, who's the Interim Director General for the Strategy Group. And we understand, Ms Acland-Hood, that Mr McCully and Mr Archer are both retiring after a very long period of service at the Department for Education. And I wondered if you'd like to say a few words.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Yes, both Andrew and Graham joined the department actually at roughly the same time, and both of them have been exemplary public servants who have contributed enormously across the work of the department. Andrew, most recently, has been the face of everything the department has done on schools policy for a number of years, and has been responsible for a huge part of the improvement in standards that we've seen over particularly the 10 years up to the pandemic. And Graham has worked on both schools and on children's social care, and indeed across a number of other areas. Both of them will be profoundly missed by colleagues across the department who've welcomed their wisdom and expertise.
Well, thank you. And Mr McCully and Mr Archer, we want to thank you too. You exemplify serious long public service aimed at improving the lot of people in this country. I'm sure at all times you've been in front of committees like this where we've criticised and challenged you on that, but we appreciate your long-standing public service and what you've contributed to this country. So thank you for that. And that's the nice bit. Now we're going to challenge you in your last 2 weeks and 2 months. So I'm sure you've girded your loins and you're prepared for that. But before we go into the main session, I just wanted to ask you, Ms Acland-Hood, we've obviously seen increased disruption in our schools because of strikes. And when I've spoken to teachers about this, they're very concerned. They don't want to go on strike. They're just they can't afford to live, and particularly in constituencies like mine in inner London. And they're very concerned about the impact of funding in the classroom. As one said, it's coming down to whether we can afford glue sticks. So I was wondering if you could update us on the situation and whether the department is getting round the table with the unions to try and sort this out and avert strike action and support teachers and pupils.
Thank you, Chair. Certainly. Yes, I hear the same thing as you, that most teachers don't want to be on strike. They want to be teaching children and helping them to succeed. And we are absolutely committed to getting around the table and sorting this out. We've made repeated offers to the unions for substantive, serious talks on pay on exactly the same basis that those offers of talks have been made to the nurses and to the other health unions who are now in negotiations. The one thing we've asked is that strikes be suspended to allow those talks to take place, and unfortunately up until this point the NEU have not been willing to suspend strikes in order to come to the table. So that's the barrier at the moment.
Have you put in any preconditions?
No, literally only that they suspend strikes in order to come to the table. That's the only precondition. This in the end, this has been going a long time. Government didn't seek to have meetings with the unions before Christmas. So what's changed? Actually, the Secretary of State did offer a meeting with the unions just before Christmas, as it happens. But we've been meeting extensively through January and February. The challenge then was that the key matters we were discussing were kind of non-pay and pay for future years. And at that stage, because we'd made quite a significant pay offer in the current year, we weren't talking about current year pay, and we were talking about next year's pay principally in the context of the STRB. That's changed now, and there's an offer to talk about pay in all years and to have really substantive conversations. But as I say, the one precondition is that strikes should be suspended to allow those talks to take place.
I mean, there's a bit of a face-off here, isn't there? Cutting off nose to spite face seems to me a phrase that comes to mind. I mean, isn't it better just to get on with those discussions without a precondition in order to make sure that you're just making sure there's progress? Someone's got to be the grown-up here. Both sides have got very strong issues that we all know from the evidence we've seen in preparation for today alone. We've just it's a reminder of the very big challenges schools are facing with finances, including on pay. Why can't the government just get around the table?
As I say, the government's ready to get around the table.
Only with a precondition.
I'll leave this meeting and go and have the talks now if the unions are willing to come to the table and have those talks in a serious way.
It's like chicken and egg. If you could have the conversation, then if it went well, the strikes might be called off. I mean, it's no budging, is what you're saying.
It's exactly the same setup has been offered to the Royal College of Nurses, to GMB, to Unison and Unite, and all of those unions have paused their strike action comes over exactly the same basis that's being offered to the NEU.
Okay, well, it is not this committee's job to have a negotiation about this, but it's helpful to have your views on the record. I'm sure that will be picked up. And on the issue of staff, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Yes, good morning everybody. And again, may I add my sincere thanks to Andrew McCully and Graham Archer on their very long service. It's a real mark of the respect that civil servants are held in when they hear examples of what you've done. So thank you. I want to ask Miss Acland-Hood about staff recruitment and retention. Mm-hmm. Now, I've talked to lots of teachers recently, as I'm sure everybody more or less in this room has, and the pressures they are on, particularly heads and deputies, are enormous. And I'm particularly conscious of the submission by Education Support, where they say most staff stated that this added 1 to 6 additional hours to their working week. This is a significant addition when we consider that in 2021, 35% of all staff and 66% of senior leaders told us that they already worked 51 hours a week. And they say that in their 2022 Teacher Wellbeing Index shows that 59% of staff have considered leaving the sector in the past academic year, and 30% of teachers reported that their work-life balance was either bad or very bad, and more than 1/3 of teachers said they're working between 10 and 25 hours outside the school day on average. I mean, this is not a great situation, is it? And I wonder what the department can do, irrespective of, I mean, clearly pay is one element of this, but working conditions is also a significant element. What can the department do to assist in this?
So I think it's really important that we work with teachers on teacher workload, and that's the approach that we've taken in the past as we've worked to reduce teacher workload, and we saw it make a real difference. So we've got good figures particularly from before the pandemic that show significant reductions in teacher workload, including the average number of hours teachers were working each week, as a result of the measures that we put in, principally around making sure that there were really good bits of advice around necessary and unnecessary tasks, essentially. There are quite a lot of things that build up over time. It's much easier to decide you need to do a new thing than to drop a thing that you've previously done. I'm actually going to ask Andrew to talk about this because he worked extensively on the workload compact with the unions and with trusts that we put out before.
Susan is absolutely right that the practice in schools or practice in wider multi-academy trusts was improving to meet the sort of challenge that you're setting out. So 3 particular areas were the focus of much of that improvement. Work around marking. Much of the workload out of hours is about marking and preparation of lessons, and the improvement there through school practice. Taking some of the myths out of accountability and Ofsted preparation. Much of school's time and the pressure on teachers was always to do with expectations of what Ofsted was looking for. So Ofsted helped with the trying to drive out some of those myths, and that certainly helped. But also a focus on meeting new employment expectations. Flexible working in schools has been slower to take root than in many other sectors, and we've been working with multi-academy trusts and other experts across the system how. Especially because of the primary system is very heavily tilted towards a female workforce, how flexible working can be better integrated. Indeed, we've only just in the last few months announced additional support through ambassador schools to actually promote some of that practice on flexible working. So. Marking and preparation, taking out some of the myths out of accountability and new practices is some of the big changes that brought down some of those workload hours.
Jeffrey.
Well, I hear those answers, but talking to one of my heads the other day, there's a whole load of pressures out there over and above these normal school activities. A head dealing with school activities, exams, budgets, recruitment of teachers and so on. They're now having to deal with a whole range of social problems. Social problems in the parents, social problems in the pupils, which you can't just walk away from. They have to be dealt with. So, I think the pressure on teachers out there is enormous. And I'm not sure that I'm hearing from either of you a real sort of plan as to how that's going to be dealt with. Otherwise, we're going to simply... I was speaking to one head the other day, in a very good Cotswold school. It got the Sunday Times of the Year award. First time, couldn't recruit a maths teacher. So this situation is clearly getting pretty dire in schools. And I don't hear from either of you a real plan as to how you're going to tackle this.
I'll start.
We're both
got
passionate about this.
And it's even the same plan. Yeah. I think the point is that we did a lot of work before the pandemic, which did have a really measurable impact on teachers' workload. I think we all accept that the pandemic has set us back in that, as in other areas, and that we need to go back, look at the things that we did that worked, recommit and do more. And that starts with partnership with teachers in looking at what is driving the workload and understanding it. And that's exactly what we did when we did the workload plan that we set out before. And that actually has been part of our discussions with the teacher unions through January and February around how we can put more things in place to work together to take the next steps on teacher workload. And there are some areas we will certainly look at again as part of that, including marking. I think your point on the kind of wider social problems and the things that schools are dealing with is really well made, though. And that's where I think the sort of joined up portfolio that my department has is extremely helpful, because the plans that we've set out recently on both children's social care and last week on special educational needs and disability are highly relevant to some of the things that teachers tell us drive that additional workload that feels as though it's a step away from the day job of teaching children. And so those two plans and the shorter term actions that we're taking now to make sure that we're supporting the whole of the community to be partners in making sure that, as it were, teachers don't feel that they are alone and having to be social workers rather than supported by a community around them who can help those things happen, I think is extremely important. And then specifically on recruitment and retention, we have bursaries in place, particularly for the priority subjects where we see the most challenging recruitment. And those bursaries go up to £27,000 with scholarships of up to £29,000 for those training in those priority subjects. And we know that those bursaries do have an impact, and we are seeing that in the training and recruitment figures for this year. So we take this really seriously, and we've got a plan that's both about the kind of those core teacher workload issues, but also about the surrounding issues that you rightly raise.
If I may, Mr. Clifton-Brown, make one addition there. We know that some of the biggest pressures and some of the greatest of loss from teachers in the profession is in their very first years. The first couple of years for a newly qualified, a newly trained teacher can be very daunting indeed. And so that's been one of the big focuses of our work to improve through the early careers framework, a substantial offer that was helped by some funding from the part of the recovery package, but it has gone wider than that, to both for dedicated training support and mentoring for every teacher in the first 2 years. 93% of all first early career teachers are receiving the full package from supported by the government. Feedback of that is really strong. We're improving it still with the to respond to some of the particular propositions for how it can be improved further. But I think that is a key part of how we can support teachers' profession, because we know from previous years just how many we lose in the first couple of years.
There's quite a lot in those answers. I'm sure the profession will want to digest that, and I think it's probably a subject we want to return to.
I was thinking exactly the same. And in fact, we asked members of the House to give us any thoughts they have on our hearings, and we had a lot on this. I particularly call out Afzal Khan MP, Samantha Dixon MP, Thangam Debonair MP and Valerie Vaz MP, who provided us with some actually quite heartbreaking evidence from their schools. And recruitment was a very big theme in those, and some other evidence which I'll touch on later. But recruitment, real shortages of teachers, and this is going to really have an impact on catch-up. So while a slightly separate subject, actually everything comes into catch-up. So I think we'll touch on some of that in the hearing, but we may well come back to it. So to give you advance warning, Ms Acland-Hood. I'm going to turn to Olivia Blake MP now. Ms Blake.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the witnesses. Just to add to the evidence that we received from the Honourable Member for Walsall South, I want to just touch on the condition of school buildings. Now, you may know that there was quite a serious incident in my constituency where a piece of cladding fell off and hit the head of a parent collecting their child and led to significant injury. This wasn't picked up as a risk in the recent condition survey of the school, and the school's actually not categorised in the most serious category. How confident are you that the surveys are picking up all issues that schools should be aware of, and how accurate do you think the risk rating is of the schools that have been surveyed?
Thank you. So there is no form of condition survey that a surveyor will tell you can reliably guarantee that it has picked up every possible issue that a building might suffer. What we try to do is make sure that we have as much information as we possibly can in order to make our assessment of risk as good as it can possibly be. But one of the reasons why we have raised school building issues as a risk is that as we build a more and more comprehensive picture, we see more risk that we understand, and we obviously take immediate action where there is risk in the school estate, but we also know that there will be a level of unknown risk underneath that, and that's one of the reasons why, and that's driven by the age profile of the school estate partly. So we had a huge bulge in building in the school estate around in the post-war period, both around demography and population and the raising of the school leaving age. And so there's a big clump of buildings in the estate that are coming towards the end of their design life all at the same time. And that's why we've invested so much. So, we put 15 billion into, about 13 billion since 2015 into keeping schools safe and operational. And then we've got the school rebuilding programme, which will rebuild or refurbish buildings at 500 schools over the next decade. We've also got the work you described through the condition data survey, which allows us to target both individual schools but also actually school types that we know may come with elevated risk. So, for example, we identified a particular set of system builds where we were seeing higher levels of risk, and we then went and targeted all of the schools that had that building type. So again, that's one of the ways that we mitigate for the fact that there is just no survey that can completely eliminate your risk of something unknown. What we try and do then is feed the data back in so we can understand the risk profile more broadly and address it.
This is a secondary point to the risk to life risks that have been identified in the surveys, but buildings such as this school that I'm talking about are cold, damp. Some have blind spots, which means that they require extra staff just to make sure that all children are within sight in the lower years. How are schools meant to balance their budgets with all these conditions and issues that they're trying to tackle? And is there a bigger plan around making our schools warmer and more eco-friendly, I suppose, as well?
Yeah, so we announced another £500 million in 22-23, which was allocated out to schools and colleges specifically for improving buildings with a focus on energy efficiency. That, again, allows schools to specifically target some of those issues that go to keeping schools warm in winter and cool in summer in a way that helps them to reduce energy cost and improve the sustainability and the impact on the planet as well.
And do you feel that the plan is adequate enough to tackle all the issues with this model of schools that you've kind of been mentioning?
So on the specific system,
and how long will it take?
On the specific system build that I described, those are all scheduled as part of the school rebuilding programme. There's the second.
When will that end? When will we see that final result?
So the school rebuilding programme is a decade-long programme, but we front-load the areas of greatest risk in the programme.
So the decade ends when? Just remind us.
Well, I would need to get back.
Okay,
I
that's
need to
fine. We can
double check.
tell
I'm
us
sorry, I should know that.
Someone behind you probably is scribbling a note.
There are other sort of construction type based issues. So the other one we're looking at, which again you may well have talked to colleagues in health about, is reinforced aerated autoclave concrete. And we are again going back round and asking schools some really dedicated questions about reinforced aerated autoclave concrete, because again it isn't something that is always easy to spot through survey. So we're going back round and testing and checking for that. If the question is, am I confident that the scale of the programmes we have at the moment will eliminate risk across the school estate, I can't say that. But what I can say is that we have got the best possible information we have to allow us to target the money in the programmes we have at the areas of greatest risk and make sure that we're reducing the risk across the school estate all the time.
Just finally on asbestos, that's obviously another big issue that's coming up regularly, but also publication of these condition surveys. Do you think that it would be in the best interests of parents to be able to see these condition surveys? They've not yet been published.
Yeah, so we've obviously given the condition data collection reports to schools and their relevant local authority or academy trust already, so every school's got its own, and they can use those alongside their own surveys and safety checks, because of course technically the responsibility for the condition of school buildings is with the responsible authority, which is the local authority for local authority schools or the trust for trust schools. We also published summary findings from the data collection in 2021. So, I mean, I'm sure some schools share those with parents already. We've also committed to publish the full data set. It's taking us a little bit of time to do it. It contains 1.2 billion data points. It's quite large. And so getting that ready for publication in a way that means it will be helpful and make sense just takes a little bit of time.
And asbestos?
Asbestos, yes. So we expect all local authorities, governing bodies and academy trusts to have robust asbestos management plans in place. And we obviously follow HSE guidance on asbestos. And we published refreshed guidance for schools in 2020, having launched the asbestos management assurance process in 2018. Again, we've spoken about this in the committee before. We had 93.3% of schools who took part by November 2021 in that first round of asbestos management processes, and we're then working our way through the remaining schools who hadn't responded to that collection, and about 24% of those non-responders have now been visited through the Condition Data Collection 2 programme, and the rest are scheduled through the rest of the programme to make sure that we pick up the non-responders.
And just finally, when would you imagine that the risks that you've highlighted would allow for school buildings to move down your risk register rather than being second?
But because of the issue I described about that kind of bulge in building, I don't think it's going to come down the risk register very soon. I think we're going to need to continue to put a lot of focus and attention on this.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting. Sobering in 2023
Yes.
that we are still talking about poor school buildings. Very briefly, Mr. Louis
Yeah,
French.
thank you, Chair. On a more positive note, I'm very grateful to DfE for several successful bids we had in Bexley for the conditional improvement funds. I'm seeing already firsthand the positive impact that's having on the education of local students, and hoping and more new buildings will open next year, which I'm looking forward to visiting. A quick question for me, just as a follow-up. Obviously, we're in this key window now of 20 to 25 years after PFI. What kind of support is DfE providing to schools that may have buildings that are coming out at the end of their life and they're having to consider what they do with them next, please?
Acland-Hood.
Yeah, so we've got a dedicated programme for schools that are transitioning out of PFIs to effectively support those transitions. There are, because of the way the PFI programme worked, there are quite a lot of different circumstances you may be in with a PFI building, and so we try and do that in a relatively bespoke way with those schools as they come off them.
So just to follow up, so if there's an academy or local school that needs advice, they can get in touch with the DfE?
Yes, they can.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. French. Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brambury.
Just one very brief question. Within this 10-year programme, obviously you can't do all schools at once, and obviously you've got to prioritise.
Yes.
And obviously you should be prioritising things like asbestos and PRC concrete. But may I suggest to you there's a third category you need to prioritise, and this arose from a school in my constituency, which was using porta cabins that had a design life for 25 years and was 40 years in. The local authority only wanted to continue to repair them. They were boiling hot in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. Worse still, there was a serious leak in one of them above the electricity meter, and all the local authority wanted to do was to repair them. Really, we should be looking at replacing these porta cabins for some more modern arrangements. So can we add that to the list of important priorities, please?
So again, we always prioritise based on risk and impact, and so if there's whatever the form of the risk is, we will look at that and put that into the prioritisation.
Drummond MP.
Thank you. Just say the Education Select Committee is doing an inquiry on teacher recruitment and retention, so perhaps we could do
We
it.
are blessed on this committee that a number of our members are on more than one committee, so thank
Oh,
you to
exactly.
Mr. Drummond for that.
So you announced about T-levels today, and you're delaying some of them. What, can I just ask, what impact is that going to have on the young people that we're looking forward to doing those particular ones? I think you had hairdressing, barbering and beauty, therapy, craft and design, media, broadcast and production, and you've also deferred the catering T-level as well. So what impact is that going to have on those young people?
Thank you. And the first thing I want to say is I want to apologise to students who were hoping to take those T-levels in September, and actually to the colleges who were preparing to offer them, because I know work has gone into that. What we've announced today is that we are delaying because the advice we've had from IFATE and from Ofqual is that they're not confident enough of the quality of the work that had been done, the materials that have been prepared. And one of the things that we have really been very clear on with T-levels is that we want to prioritise quality and make sure that the qualifications are really good and are really setting young people up for success. And so it was a very difficult decision for ministers to make, and we wish we hadn't put them in the position of having to make it. But that priority on making sure that when we do start, particularly when students start on a brand new qualification, they actually take a bit of risk. I talk to T-level students quite often about the fact that they are pathfinding with us and helping us to develop qualifications. But I don't think we should ask them to take unreasonable risk on qualifications where there's a challenge with quality. One of the things we did as we prepared to make this announcement was talk to providers about making sure they were confident that they had alternative courses that they could offer to young people, and they were confident about that, and they were also keen that we made the announcement as quickly as possible once we'd identified the issues, which is what we've done in order to make sure there's time to plan.
Are you confident, though, that just a year, you're just deferring it by a year, that is going to rectify all those issues?
Yes, I am. There are some specific issues related to a particular awarding organisation, and we've had really good conversations with that awarding organisation and with others, which puts us in a good position with the year's deferral.
Okay. And for the young people that haven't got the qualifications to take T-levels, that have been taking BTECs, what are you going to do for them? Because you're getting rid of the BTECs.
So we're not getting rid of BTECs. What we're doing is we are removing BTECs that overlap with
Exactly.
T-levels,
Yeah.
but we'll retain many BTECs that don't overlap with T-levels, and we've also looked at a lot of young people take BTECs as part of mixed programmes of study with A-levels, and those smaller BTEC qualifications that form part of those mixed programmes of study will continue, and the work that has been done over recent years on quality of BTECs have helped to put us in the position where we're really confident about that. But one of the really enduring challenges of the vocational education system in this country has been enormous complexity. So whereas we have a relatively simple system on the general qualifications side, which most people understand and can explain, we've had a spectacularly complicated qualifications landscape for students taking vocational qualifications, and we have typically layered new things on top of old things in a sort of endless geological set of strata, which makes it extremely difficult for people to navigate the system, for employers to understand it, for parents to understand what their children might be doing. And we really want to simplify and streamline, and to say if we've got really good qualifications like T-levels, equivalent of 3 A-levels, these are large qualifications, that we will really slim down, so we don't have things that are effectively kind of similar but not quite the same in that space.
So there will be qualifications like BTECs for young people that are not able to take T-levels. So I'm looking at catering, hairdressing. Maybe haven't got the academic qualifications to do T-levels because you have to get a GCSE in maths and English, for instance.
So
are you going to provide qualifications for them?
So the T-levels are a really rigorous level 3 qualification, they're A-level equivalent. There isn't actually an entry requirement. You don't have to have maths and English to get onto a T-level. Some colleges are currently setting that as an entry requirement, partly because the qualifications are new and partly because they are quite challenging and rigorous. But it's not part of the kind of design of T-levels that you're required to have English and maths in order to enter them. And I was talking to a group of T-level students actually on one of our DFE virtual visits. So we do visits we make available to everybody so that the department can see things they're less familiar with. And the tutor there was saying that actually his T-level, he'd seen students with a lot of different starting points have real success on his T-level, and that his view was that in some other colleges the requirements being made around entry were effectively kind of but were partly responding to the newness of the qualification and the development of teaching in the qualification. And the critical thing is that we are getting young people up to a standard at the end of the qualification that is really good quality and really worthwhile, and that we aren't reducing that standard in order to effectively give the illusion of more access to more students. Now, there will be some students for whom a level 3 course is not appropriate, and level 2 courses will remain for those students.
And where we need to get on. So.
Yes, thank you very much, Mrs. Drummond. I just wanted one final point before we get into the main session, and thank you for your patience and dealing with these other topics. But in London, we're seeing a lot of dropping of school rolls. So in my own borough, but elsewhere, we're seeing numbers reduce. And yet, there are still new free schools in the pipeline across, and obviously London's a bit of a hotspot for that. Is there any plan to put a brake on or reduce new free schools opening where pupil rolls are dropping in an area?
I'm going
Mr. McCully.
Turn to Mr. McCully.
We look at every free school project, even though initial commitments may have been given to ensure that there is a place need for it. And we have continued to take free school projects out of the system and to cancel them when the need is not there.
Is there a point of no return where you wouldn't cancel a free school?
The only point of no return is when a signed funding agreement with the trust.
That is very helpful to hear. Thank you very much indeed. And I want to just put on record our thanks to all those who put in evidence to this session. We had a really interesting package of evidence, some very heartbreaking, as I've highlighted, not just from MPs, I mentioned them earlier, but from very many other groups, and that's been particularly helpful in our deliberations ahead of this session. And I'd like to then kick off on the main topic, which is education recovery in schools, and I'll start with Olivia Blake, MP. Ms. Blake.
Thank you, Chair. Just to Susan Acland-Hood, if that's okay. When will we start to see the gap in attainment between disadvantaged pupils and other pupils start to close again?
As soon as possible. So one of the most I think for everybody in the department and actually everybody across the system, one of the most dispiriting really effects of the pandemic has been that widening of the attainment gap, which we were successfully closing before the pandemic. So if I use the disadvantage gap index figures, so this is, I'll just really briefly explain what it is because they're a bit of a sort of string of numbers, but we use a disadvantage gap index both at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, which is arrived at by ranking every pupil in the country and then looking at the differences between disadvantaged and advantaged.
I think we need to cut to the answers rather than the explanation.
Sorry, if we were perfectly equal, it would be 0. If we were perfectly unequal, it would be 10. In 2011, that gap at Key Stage 2 was 3.34. It reduced steadily 3.23 in 2012, 3.10 in 3.10 in 2015, down to 2.90 in 2018. In 2022, it was back to 3.23, not quite as wide as in 2011,
but backwards.
But going significantly backwards. And that has been the relentless... looking at how we can close that attainment gap has been the relentless focus of our education recovery work, and it's why pretty much every element of the education recovery programme has been tilted towards disadvantaged pupils. So both the national tutoring programme, the recovery premium, which is paid to pupil premium pupils, actually everything we know about the investment in teacher education and training, which is another very large part of the recovery programme. Although that benefits every pupil, we also know that good quality teaching benefits disadvantaged pupils the most. So I would hope to see narrowing starting from this summer.
Ms. Blake.
So Mr. Archer, then, how confident are you that the department is doing enough to tackle the disadvantage gap, given, as Miss Acland-Hood said there, the gap is bigger now than any point since 2012?
So I think that right through the pandemic, and certainly from the moment that it was clear that that disadvantage gap was opening, we have focused sharply on that issue. We've distributed funding around the national tutoring programme so that it focuses very much on disadvantaged pupils. The recovery premium was different to the catch-up premium because we distributed it according to disadvantage, and then according to both disadvantage and the differential between primary and secondary, so focusing on the places where need was greatest. And in the school's white paper as we go forward, and more generally, there is a package of measures which looks at those things which are most likely to drive really good engagement from all pupils, and particularly for disadvantaged pupils. And the fact that we expect, for example, the national tutoring programme to be an ongoing part of the system is, I think, testament to that desire to see that gap close, and the way in which we have incentivised teachers to work in the most disadvantaged places too, I think, is a really important part of that. So I think it is a strong package of measures. I think that the opening of the gap over the pandemic is one of the worst impacts of that period, and I think there is a good package of measures now in place to help us to move that gap. So
in a word, do you feel that it is enough?
So one can always do more, but I think that the package that we have in place is a good, strong one, looking forward and indeed building on things that have happened during the pandemic to move us to a better place.
Okay, and Miss Acland-Hood, can I just ask when you'd hope to eliminate the disadvantage gap completely?
So it would be wonderful to eliminate the disadvantage gap completely. I asked the team whether there was any country around the world that had so far completely eliminated its disadvantage gap, and there isn't. And that means that I'm a little bit reluctant to promise the committee a date by which we will manage to have done that. But I do think we should be able to reduce the gap at least as quickly as we did in the 10 years before the pandemic. We know we can do that. We did it. And we ought to be setting ourselves the challenge of going that fast or faster and continuing to close it.
But so it's as fast, that's still a decade.
As fast
to get
or faster.
back to where we were the year before the pandemic.
If we can go faster than that, we will. But
we appreciate a lot of the issues, as we've had from the very heart-wrenching evidence, isn't just about what's happening in school. Yes. It's about home life, mental health, and all the rest of it. So that, are you talking to other departments?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in terms of vulnerable children within that disadvantaged group, do you think enough is action in the plans that you just kind of set out are available to that specific group?
Yes, I mean, vulnerability's got lots of dimensions to it. I mean, there are several things that we did. Of course, one of the most important was that schools never closed for vulnerable pupils through the pandemic. And I actually want to just take a moment to thank teachers and heads who kept schools open throughout the pandemic for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children. They did the most phenomenal job. And I mean, I did actually want to read into the record, given kind of some recent events, that the huge hard work, dedication, and impressive resolve and professionalism of teachers through the pandemic is something that has been an inspiration and we honour that. We know that teachers haven't always felt as well supported as they wanted to be, but we really have been working to try and support them as well as we possibly can. So
in short, you were embarrassed by the recent leaked WhatsApp messages from the former.
I couldn't possibly comment on that.
But I think you've made your position clear, and I'm sure teachers will be glad to hear that you reward them.
So we allowed teachers to define who was a vulnerable pupil for the purposes of keeping schools open during the pandemic, and that was extremely important because vulnerability comes in many forms. We've also got specific support for groups that we know to be vulnerable. So, for example, for children with special educational needs and disability, where we both offered that support kind of right in the early stages of the pandemic, but also, for example, our recovery premium amounts are significantly higher for pupils in specialist and alternative provision, including special units in mainstream schools. We also have made sure that we were working through our children's social care responsibilities to support children in care. The work that the virtual school heads have done over the years really came into its own both during and after the pandemic. And for example, I'm sure the committee will want to come to attendance later in the session, but
yes,
one of the changes in attendance patterns over time that I don't think we talk about enough is that it used to be the case that children in public care had worse attendance than other children. Actually, they now have better attendance than other children because of the support they're given through social work and virtual school heads.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms Blake. Mrs Flick-Drummond, MP.
Yes, going back to attendance, particularly SEND. On the Education Select Committee this week, we talked about that, and you may have read the transcript on it. A huge number of children with SEND are not attending schools.
Just spell out special educational needs and disabilities.
Sorry.
For those
and children from disadvantaged backgrounds too. So how are you working to make sure that those particular groups are coming into school, and also to closing that attainment gap? Because you said that we're going to get there, but they're the ones that we really need to focus on. So you're doing any specific projects to get those particular group of children back into school?
On attendance specifically, just give me 1 second. I'm over-flagged. So a lot of our attendance work starts with the principle that you begin with support. And that's particularly important for children who have other disadvantages. But we've set out a much stronger set of expectations on all of the partners in attendance, so schools, trusts, but also...
Particularly about attendance for special education.
Yes, so we're just going to say, but local authorities are a really key partner in that, and they're a particularly key partner for children with special educational needs. I think there are distinctions to be made between children who are not in school because they don't have an allocated school place, which again we're addressing through the provision of more places, which we announced last week alongside the publication of the Special Educational Needs and Disability and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan. And then there are a group of children who have a school place but have challenges in attending. So again, we see some children who, for example, became more anxious about attendance during the pandemic and need habits rebuilt. And there are a set of proposals that are around local authorities identifying children most at risk and creating bespoke action plans for them, where again their role for children with special educational needs will be particularly pronounced because of their responsibilities in that regard.
And have you got the resources to be able to put that in place? Because I know local authorities are quite stretched at the moment.
Yeah, so there are, for special educational needs and disability in particular, there is a kind of bringing together of attendance resource and the special educational needs resource that local authorities are responsible for. There are also some additional things we're doing more widely across the attendance piece that are relevant. So we've got 10 expert attendance advisors working with local authorities and trusts in a hands-on way to review their practices, develop plans and help them meet the kind of new expectations that we've set, including for regular meetings on individual persistently absent children at local authority level. And we've also got work going on in Middlesbrough piloting a mentor programme providing direct support to persistently and severely absent children, for example.
So using that good practice that's happening in some places, you're spreading
Yes.
it out to the rest of the country. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs Drummond. So I just wanted to move on to the tutoring scheme, the Randstad scheme, first of all. So I think Mr Archer, that was your baby, so to speak. And it was interesting in response to Miss Blake that you said that you think you're doing there's a good job going on. But we've already highlighted in the early bit of the session that there are big challenges in just having the right people, teachers in place, classroom assistants in place. A lot of evidence came up with that. So but this particular scheme, the Randstad scheme, the contract that you had with Randstad was that 65% of pupils supported through addition to the partner scheme would be disadvantaged. And it's interesting that schools had already automatically in all of the other tutoring had progress on disadvantaged pupils, but you didn't meet that target.
Yes,
so why was that? And why did you set 65%? I'd just be interested in your thinking behind why that was set.
So it's worth just starting with a little bit of the history. We had
Sorry, if you let Mr Archer speak, sorry, the microphones pick everyone up. Mr Archer, apologies.
No worries. It's we had a smaller scale scheme which we had established in the early part of the pandemic, and when we appointed Randstad as our delivery partner, we were looking to scale that up by a factor of 3 or 4, I think, and as part of that, we established a target, which is that we wanted to see Randstad deliver 65% of those places to disadvantaged pupils, as you say. That target wasn't achieved. It was always set as a stretching target intended to go beyond the numbers that we had got in the first year. I think the target did contribute significantly to seeing around 50% of the tutoring that was undertaken by disadvantaged pupils. So while we didn't hit the target that we intended, we did, I think, have an impact on the way in which levels of disadvantage were tackled by the programme. It's worth saying that in the school population as a whole, 27% of pupils are eligible for free school meals. Of the population of those tutored, that number was nearer to 50%. So there was definitely a positive skew to those from disadvantaged backgrounds within schools. And we were keen, and there's a balance in all of this, isn't there, between what you dictate from the centre and what you leave to schools who know their pupils best. And the Permanent Secretary's already said, how much we have valued the work of teachers over the pandemic period, and leaving ultimately in their hands which of those pupils were most likely to benefit from tutoring was a really important part of what we wanted to do. So no, we didn't hit the target. That's plain. But I think the target did contribute to the overall impact of the scheme.
Okay, well, we're going to come into we'll look later on at tutoring more widely, but on this particular target, money was provided to Randstad to do this. They were set this target but didn't achieve it. Same as Acland-Hood. Only half of the tutoring was going to disadvantaged pupils. I mean, are you happy? Because we've just talked about that the gap has increased. It's going to be maybe 10 years. I mean, not fixing you to the 10 years. Obviously, we'd all hope it'd be quicker, but it could be 10 years from what you said before that gap is closed again. So, given that there's a contract that you went into, are you unhappy with that 50% rate, and why, and what can you do to try and get this targeted? What could you have done to get this up? What did you not do, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, I think I'd go back to the point that Mr. Archer made, which is that within all of this, Randstad were working with schools, but it was ultimately schools who were deciding which pupils were tutored. And I think I would have been very unhappy if, for example, we hadn't. So it was still the case that a disadvantaged pupil was about twice as likely to be tutored as a non-disadvantaged pupil under this scheme. And I would have been very unhappy if we hadn't seen a significant skew towards disadvantaged pupils. But we also see in the catch-up data that although there is a gap, there are also lots of other pupils who've fallen behind significantly. So pupils with low prior attainment, whatever their disadvantaged backgrounds, have been disproportionately affected. And actually that's a pattern we see in the school system more widely, that if you have low prior attainment, there's a point where it becomes difficult to access the curriculum. There are some disadvantaged pupils whose attainment is good, who may have been better served by really good quality whole class teaching.
Are you saying really, so the definition of disadvantaged is obviously quite narrowly technically defined, but you're saying that there are other pupils who had disadvantages,
yes,
who couldn't really just be left because you were skewing it towards. But I mean, the point is, there's still pupils who haven't had the tutoring, really, isn't it? And that's the who needed it. So there's a gap.
So what we did was make available as much tutoring as we possibly could for schools to point at the pupils they believed needed it most, and we wanted to assure ourselves that within that, disadvantaged pupils were being kind of well served. And I think disadvantaged pupils being twice as likely to be tutored as non-disadvantaged pupils, gives some comfort on that. What we didn't seek to do was prevent schools from tutoring pupils that didn't meet a technical definition of disadvantage. And indeed, we when we asked schools about how they targeted, the vast majority said that they used disadvantage to target, low prior attainment. They also, for example, targeted pupils in exam years, and particularly in secondary schools. And there's logic in that, because you had a group of pupils whose time in school was running out effectively, and where if you didn't make the impact on them as they approached those kind of final public exams, the school was running out of the opportunity to make a difference. But for a school, for example, that has targeted pupils in exam years, that would be likely to give you slightly more non-disadvantaged pupils. But we thought it was important that schools had the opportunity to make those choices. The last thing I'll say is, as we looked forward in the programme, so with Randstad, we were running a kind of national offering, and Randstad were also working with the schools to bring them on board into the programme. And so it was really important to have that kind of a target that we set them to help them direct their efforts, because we also didn't want them to be targeting schools that needed it. So there was the between school and the in-school point, if that makes sense. Once we moved to school-led tutoring, actually what we did was allocate the money on the basis of pupil premium. So we did the targeting towards disadvantage in a different way.
It's interesting. I mean, schools were, Ofsted found, didn't they, that schools were picking, were using disadvantages as the main baseline criteria.
They did.
So, Mr. McCully, I mean, when you look, I think it may be you, maybe Mr. Archer.
I'm sure we could share.
Yeah. With your vast years of experience, I'm sure it's not a problem for either of you. But there would be, if individual schools were making these individual judgments, and we've had a lot of evidence, which I haven't got time to go into, about how well different things work. We'll come back to some of that, I think, later on. But are you trying to get lessons learnt from the best performing schools passed around other schools? Because it was a whole new extra thing for schools to take on, to embrace tutoring.
Yes.
And we're not really here to discuss, well, we can discuss a bit whether the national versus the local work better. We know there was a problem with some of the original contracts. But what are you doing to make sure that the best, the worst, the schools that are still struggling with this are learning from the better performing schools? And are there really good examples that you can point to?
I mean, the National Tutoring Programme has been a one that has developed year on year, and the experience and the learning has developed year on year. So sharing best practice is absolutely fundamental to the.
How are you doing that? So
in a number of ways, directly with the support that we offer to schools. We have webinars. We have shared promotions. We have research that is shared. We've had a fundamental programme of research that has embedded further guidance into the schools about what effective tutoring looks like, and particularly highlight the work of the Education Endowment Foundation and NFER, who've been behind that research to enable good practice to be shared across schools. And part of the model that is now underpinning the programme of the National Tutoring Programme involves a greater role of the department itself, and our both our evidence and our direct digital support to the schools. So we have direct customer support into schools as part of the national tutoring programme in a way that we didn't have before, and that is a key part of the sharing directly into schools.
Are there any geographical areas of the country or types of school or that you are, as a category, I'm not asking you to name individuals, that you're very worried about, and are there others that will be doing a particularly good job?
I have to say, one of the in the early days, we had a lot of worries and feedback from different organisations that there would be differential rates of tutoring, and indeed different access to professional tutors. One of the, I think, real successes of the National Tutor Programme is that we're not seeing that at the moment. Indeed,
was there some of it geographical? Because there was some discussion earlier on about where you'd find
There was an issue, but there isn't now.
Yes, today, in fact, the Sutton Trust is publishing a report. The Sutton Trust has been concerned over the years about that disadvantaged children in certain areas of the country have not had access to tutoring, irrespective of the central government programmes, and it's been a key part of their concern about social mobility, for instance, of the lack of access. Their report today says that there's been a complete turnaround in terms of access, and so it's the very areas of disadvantage that are now increasingly benefiting from the input of school tutoring, counteracting that lack of
What's
access
turned
to
around? Where have
content.
these tutors suddenly appeared from? Because there were deserts.
I wonder if I can say a little bit about that. We, in the early part of the programme, we monitored really closely both take-up in regions and the availability of tutors in regions. And essentially there were two things that I think we did to shift the dial. We encouraged very significantly tutoring organisations to expand their operations so that they moved into areas where there was less obvious availability, essentially moving them northwards from areas where they had operated more frequently. The second thing that we did was respond to feedback from schools. I was going to say particularly from the north of England. That's sort of true, but it was universal, but skewed towards the north, that they wanted to control tutoring themselves. So the creation of the school-led route and the increased emphasis on the school-led route was precisely about responding to feedback from schools, including those from the north, where the tutoring market, if you like, was a little less well developed at the beginning of the process.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of the issues on tutoring a little later, but I'm going to turn to Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Yes, could I turn to the subject that Mr. Drummond was talking about, and this is absences. And I think perhaps first come to you, Mr. McCully, if I may, please. We know that in the autumn and spring terms of 21-22, the average absence rate fell for all pupils by 7.4%, but compared to 4.5% in the same terms before the pandemic in 2018-19. But particularly for disadvantaged pupils, the rate was 10.4% in 21-22, compared with 7.2% 18-19. So whilst absences is damaging all pupils, it's particularly damaging disadvantaged pupils. Can you just fill out for us a bit more what the department's plans are to deal with absences?
Yeah. I recognise those figures, and those figures are improving, which is an important point to recognise. Figures are the most recent improvements are coming out of the back of reductions in illness over the end of last year. So I mean, illness and the prevalence of respiratory infections and things like that is part and parcel of managing of understanding and managing attendance. So it's improving, but as you rightly point out, it's there's more to be done. key things about the improvement of attainment is that school children need to be in school. That's the most important place for them. So the key actions, I think, and indeed Susan referred to that in a little earlier of this inquiry, the strong expectations that attendance is everyone's responsibility, school leaders and those around school and parents, and so the guidance that we still fully intend to make statutory when we have the legislative opportunity to do so, but is already guiding partners, schools, local authorities, and others. That brings all those actions together. Data is really important. We now, through revisions and I think quite a revolutionary change to the way in which schools offer the department their attendance data, so that we can have a full picture and that schools can share that, and means that schools and the department and other partners can extract from that data trends and particular issues and particular sort of solutions to that in a way that we've never had before. And I think that's a real important step forward to the sort of real management through information and through data. Leadership, I think, is really important. We have what we call the Attendance Action Alliance, both at national level, but it's increasingly being replicated at local levels as well, which brings together those key players who can make a difference, both in terms of the leadership that they bring to their sectors and the expectations of the contribution of particular sectors. And to give one example how that turns to action at the local level, for instance, one of the key participants at the national level is Paul Tarn, Chief Executive of one of the very best multi-canal trusts, Delta. He has established a whole series of demonstration sort of partnerships across other multi-academy trusts about how to act the best on attendance. I'd only add the sort of targeted support that in fact Susan mentioned a little earlier in terms of the working with sort of local authorities, especially through the Supporting Families and Virtual Schools programs, because that gets to the most vulnerable children. So you can see from that it's a full set of sort of complementary activities, because attendance needs to be everyone's business.
That's a very helpful answer, Mr. McCully. I think everybody's now agreed from those figures that absences particularly affect disadvantaged children. And going back to the Chair's question to Ms. Acland-Hood earlier on attainment gap, which I found the answer slightly alarming, that it was going to take another 10 years to get back to where we were in 2012, if I've interpreted your answer correctly, Ms. Acland-Hood. Considering we now know a lot more about what mechanisms work and what don't work to close this attainment gap, I would have thought we were to be able to do a lot better than that in 12 years. But clearly one of the things of closing that attainment gap is this business of absence from schools, particularly for disadvantaged pupils. So what more work, and why is it that disadvantaged children have a higher absence from schools? And what can we do about it?
I think what everyone tells us, what partners tell us, and I mentioned the Attendance Action Alliance. It is both it's not just a point of leadership. It also enables the better understanding of what works right the way through the system. So what we have been learning through that is the whole range of different effective approaches that great schools, great trusts working with the local authorities have been bringing to bear. And the whole range of different individual approaches, whether it's work with individual parents, whether it's the direct support, often phoning, the practices of phoning parents up in the morning, direct mentoring activities. The support first approach is a phrase that you'll hear a lot from all of the members of the Action Alliance and their counterparts at the local levels, because it is a reminder of how the combinations of different support needs to be brought together to address the particular needs, challenges of different individual disadvantaged young people.
So I'm very interested in your data-driven approach to this. So you will be able to see differences between schools and trends taking place within schools. Now, one of the anecdotal trends that we're hearing is that actually absences are higher on a Friday.
Yes.
So you should be able to pick that up and then start to do something about it.
I might just come in on this. So the data really does make a difference, and what we're able to do now is draw attendance data directly out of school management information systems on a daily basis, and we now do that for about 80% of the state-funded schools in the country. We've put that in place over just a little bit more than a year, and that's schools voluntarily signing up to give us that information. The burden is zero for schools because it just pulls straight out of the system, but what it allows us to do is look in a much more fine-grained way at patterns across time to see things in much more real time, and then what we offer back to schools in the system is views of their data, and we've just introduced the latest shift to more benchmarking data, which allows them to compare themselves, and again we'll keep refining and developing that so they can look at themselves against other similar schools. And again, we know that on other topics that benchmarking approach really does help. On the days of the week, this is something we actually picked up using our rather clunkier and less elegant data collection mechanisms during COVID. And it's one of those things that I think anecdotally people have always known to be true, but we've never been able to see it in the data before, because previously our attendance data collection was always a sort of annual school census mechanism.
Less of the mechanism, but what's the information you're getting?
So it's true that the data shows that attendance is lower on a Friday than on other days of the week. It's a little bit lower on Monday.
That is really a matter for parents, isn't it? For the school to get on to parents and say, look, it's not acceptable just because the parents are working at home that the pupils and children can stay away from school on a Friday.
I don't think you can infer that it's all about working from home, because again, anecdotally, it's a pattern that pre-existed the pandemic. And for some children, for example, it may be that, again, we still see the biggest driver of absence being illness. So, for example, if you're ill, it may be that after 4 days of school you're exhausted. So I think we should be very careful that what the data tells us is that absence is lower on a Friday. It doesn't tell us
but you
why.
don't know what the cause is.
Okay. But just finally on this absence business, I like the idea that your policy of feeding back to schools the data you're receiving. How quickly does that happen?
So they can see it in real time on the same day.
Real time?
Yes.
That's very good. Thank you very much.
It's completely automated, so
Continue.
Want me to go on to send?
Yeah.
Thank you. May I move on to a completely different subject, and the send review. And firstly, this committee, in its Treasury Minute response, agreed with the recommendation, set a target implementation for the SEND report of autumn 2020. Now, mercifully, we have now had it from the Parliamentary Under Secretary on the 2nd of March 23.
Spring 23.
3 years later. Why did it take so long?
So, first of all, I actually wanted to... Sorry, I'm going to need a glass of water. I just wanted to thank this committee. This committee has been absolutely dogged and dedicated to making sure that we not only kind of do this well and seriously, but that we keep ourselves moving on it. And
Well,
I appreciate that.
That's right. We love to take things, but if you could answer the question about why it took so long.
So, and we've spoken about this in this committee before. So it was absolutely right to start with a green paper and to make sure that we gave time for consultation, because the one thing we know about SEND reform is that it will not succeed unless it is done in partnership with parents and others in the system. So the first thing is we knew that in order for this to be a successful process, we would need to have a significant period of consultation. There was a delay in getting that consultation document out, and that was partly because we had to divert. So in the very early part of the pandemic, we diverted people to do pandemic response. After that, we did work on the green paper, and we started to share it with partners. And again, we spoke about this at the time in the committee. We had concerns from partners that it didn't sufficiently recognised the change of circumstances due to the pandemic, that it needed more thought and more work. And again, it was quite important that we listened to that. So I know it took longer than we had hoped, but I think it took us to a better product as a result. And I would much rather do this well than as fast as possible and not well. I appreciate that it would be even better to do it both fast and well. I think since the publication of that green paper, we have proceeded with quite good pace, actually. So with consultation all over the summer, and then in the context of quite a lot of ministerial change, to publish in this spring, I think is not bad. And sorry, I actually would really like to thank colleagues in the department who've worked on this, and all of the partners across the system who have worked with us on it.
We clock that.
I'm sure that's appreciated, and I entirely agree with what you need. You need to do it well when it's done, and it's now got a 9-point plan, and it looks pretty comprehensive. So, and it needs to be, because the current situation is pretty dire. So why are you not expecting to have a full set of the new national standards even by the end of 2025?
So we've committed to start with the national standards that touch on the things that we know people most want, so on autism, on mental health, for example. We want to go as quickly as we possibly can in creating the national standards, but again, we know that they'll only work if we co-create them with others across the system. We need to make sure we're bringing the right people together to set the national standards, and that they are national standards that will hold and sustain. And so we've set ourselves the aim of getting as many of those kind of most urgent and wide spectrum standards out as soon as possible. But because of the range of need and experience that is covered by special educational needs and disability as a headline description, we think the full suite of national standards is likely to be very extensive. So this is one of those things where we hope to have a set of national standards out that will cover a lot of the need that's out there, but there'll be a very long tail of individual need where it will take us a bit longer to get through all of the national standards.
My problem with this is that if I were a parent of a child in Gloucestershire, and Gloucestershire is particularly bad, and it's incredibly difficult to get an EHCP plan. I mean, you've got to jump through God knows how many hoops to get one. I'd say, well, that's all very well, but you know, my child needs a special needs plan now. So what hope can you offer those parents?
So I think the first thing is that, I mean, as we discussed in this committee before, we're not waiting for the full implementation of the plan in order to take action. We've got the work that we've done through delivering better value in the safety valve programme, which has put hundreds of millions of pounds into the system to help local authorities look at and shift their service. And the centre of the plan is about making sure that the provision that parents and children should expect is clear, and that it can be accessed by many more people without needing to go through the process of getting a plan. So we do want to make sure that the EHCP plan process is streamlined, but actually what we really want is for many, many more parents to get the support they need for their child without having to go through a hoop-jumping process of writing a plan of that kind. And so the critical first stage will look at some of the national standards that make sure that parents, teachers and pupils know what should ordinarily be available, including in mainstream settings. And we've also got significant investment in teacher training. We'll train several thousand more early years special educational needs coordinators to help identify children who need support as soon as possible, because we know that early identification helps avoid escalation of need and make sure people get the support they need earlier. We were also training 400 more educational psychologists, which will reduce the wait times for specialist support. And we've also reformed the accountability system. We'll put in place dashboards that help people see what those times are. Again, take that data-focused approach where we can drive change. And of course, we've also got the announcement of 33 new special schools, and that's in addition to the 49 that are already in the free schools pipeline, because the other constraint in the system is supply of those specialist places, particularly in the maintained sector for children who need them.
See, the problem is, if I were a head teacher or a deputy head listening to this exchange, I'd say this is all very well. I'd love to be able to provide more special needs out of the statutory education and health plan, but I simply haven't got the funding to do so. I haven't got the staff to do it. So
the evidence we've had has been very particularly on classroom assistance and one-to-one support.
Yes, this one-to-one support is it's often included in the plans, but it's not really available in most of my schools to anyone else because they simply haven't got the staff. They're struggling with class sizes and assistant teachers as they are. So will the 2.6 billion between now and 2025 to fund new special and alternative provision places and improve the existing provision cover those situations?
So the 2.6 billion is particularly capital provision for new specialist school places. But we've also significantly increased the amount of funding going into the system. So the high needs budget will rise to over £10 billion by next year, which is an increase of more than 50% since 2019. I mean, again, we've discussed this in the committee before, but the challenge we're meeting through this implementation plan is that we have a system in which we are both seeing costs and spending escalate, and we're not seeing people feel as though their needs are being met. And that is partly because more and more of the budget is being hoovered to the highest end because we're less able to put that support in earlier.
Precisely my question.
I
those
agree
not quite at that very sharp end, but still need extra help. I mean, I was a very late reader. I needed extra help, so I know what these. But I would never have got a health plan, statutory EHCP plan. So it's people like me, being just using me as an example, that need that extra help. How can you reassure them that their parents that they're going to get that?
And that comes back to those standards about what should ordinarily be available. That's not just an expectation without support. That's also about trying to, because again, we see very, very different patterns across the country, and we do see local authorities where they're much more successful in wrapping that support around lower level needs in school. One-to-one support isn't always the right answer. So, for example, for early reading...
So Jeffrey's not talking about the one-to-one support.
But for early reading, for example, in that investment we made in systematic synthetic phonics, I was talking to a researcher at Cambridge the other day who was saying to me, there used to be a thing called a garden variety poor reader, and we've essentially eliminated the garden variety poor reader by investment in phonics. So you now... There's a really interesting thing. That garden variety poor reader locates the problem in the child. Actually, the problem wasn't located in the child. It was about making sure we were giving teachers the equipment to teach really well to a class of children. And so there's also a slice of this that is about investment in really good quality whole class teaching that helps every child do their best.
Well, we could have a long discussion about inclusion and wider support, but I think we need to move on to mental health.
Yes, I must take the chair's hint and move on. Mental health. We've had lots of evidence on mental health problems from all sorts of witnesses. I think I'd perhaps like to start with the mental health evidence submitted by Young Minds. And they say the Department for Education should meaningfully implement a whole school approach to mental health, well-being and social and emotional learning across all statutory and non-statutory guidance. What more can you tell us? Perhaps we start with, you're nodding your head, Mr. McCully. I'm sure you've dealt with this all your life. It would be grateful for your experience.
I agree with the Young Minds recommendation, and that is certainly the approach that we try and promote and instill within schools, and that's why a key part of the investment in improvement had been around both the identification of and the training of senior mental leads for every school. We now have over 10,000 schools and colleges who've been helped by that grant, and another 10 million is going into each 2/3 state schools and colleges by the end of this financial year. So, and that with that objective of promoting sort of a whole school approach, because that's so important because of the range of different needs. One of the objectives in truly effective mental health support is not necessarily to pathologise and make it and see it as always a clinical question, but to have that support in early, and that's the the training is very much with that in mind. The further rollout of the mental health support teams, which has been such a big part of our joint work with NHS England and the Department of Health and Social Care, is also fundamental to that. We have a ambition to, with the amount of funding that has been made available in this substantial programme, to reach 35% of children through 35% of schools through that support, and we're on track to do that. Indeed, the acceleration of work through additional investment of the spending review for mental health, and the Department of Health and Social Care really has supported that.
So also young minds say that the mental health support team must sit alongside other forms of support to ensure that as many young people are able to access help that works for them within the school environment. And of course part of that is actually recognising that a particular pupil has a mental health problem. So there's two elements to this. That's the ordinary teacher who hopefully has had some training to actually recognise there's a problem with a particular pupil, and then there's the mental health support teams actually providing that help. So could you just address those two particular bits?
Yeah. Again, so important. I once again agree wholeheartedly with young minds there, and indeed the whole concept of a joint programme between the DFE and DHSC is to ensure that the join between health and education is replicated right the way through the system. So, for instance, I have a team of regional workers whose prime focus is to make sure that when the when NHS England is establishing those teams, they are effectively joined to the leadership and actions of head teachers in those areas to provide the sort of whole school approach that Young Minds is talking about.
And then they say that the rollout of mental health support teams and designated senior leads for mental health should be accelerated to all schools by 2028.
Similarly reflected actually in other evidence from the Children and Young People's Mental Health Coalition. So you said 35% I think of schools will get it. So yeah, if it's working, which we hope it will, why not everyone?
And that level of investment, which was secured in the last spending review, takes us to that level. Going beyond that requires would require more investment, and that will need to be subject to the next spending review. But there'll be the success of the work so far will be a strong point of evidence and indeed sort of encouragement for future decisions.
Whole cohorts of children won't get support in the time they're in school.
Going as fast as we can with the resources that have been made available.
There will be young adults who will have suffered but not had the support at an adolescent stage.
Going as fast as we can with the resources.
I can't leave this section, Mr. McCully, without talking about mental health of teachers. I can't just tear it up and find it at the moment, the evidence, but we've had evidence about mental health this week. Support for teachers. What more can be done? Well, I mean, it's all part of the general pressure that I was referring to earlier on teachers, but at the worst end, it does result in mental health problems for teachers and therefore absenteeism. What more can be done to support them?
And I hear that a lot of all my conversations with school leaders and teacher unions. That is, we've seen more of that from COVID, as I'm sure you recognise. We put in place and funded a support programme, particularly for leaders of schools, because that was where the biggest pressures on COVID, and that's been so welcome so much that we expanded the programme. It's something that we initiated a well-being charter, which was signed by organisations across the sector, focusing on the principles of support for teachers and for school leaders, that once again brings together the focus that needs to be made, because it's only with confident and well supported teachers that the sort of attainment objectives that we've been talking about earlier in the questions can be achieved. So it's a fundamental priority of both the right thing to do, important for teachers, but also for their wider objectives.
Well, it's almost required of an employer to provide that support.
I have to say, we had evidence of, this is from the Honourable Member for Walsall, who got evidence from different schools. One head saying, I see some of my staff ready to crumble, and that is not right. Some of this is impact from COVID, but some is the erosion of funding for years and the funding of core services supporting schools and families. Having a charter on wellbeing is all very well, Mr McCully, but the pressures on schools before COVID were immense. They've exacerbated hugely. So, I mean, I think the points in the evidence are well made. I won't go into that in more now at this point. But Sir Geoffrey, if you've got any last points?
No, I think that's
very quick point from Ms Blake.
On mental health, just to ask, how will you ensure a whole school approach is inclusive? For example, to students who may have hearing loss and deafness, or a specific learning disability, or a neurodivergence. How will you ensure that the offer is there for all those students?
One of the reasons, and Susan has brought a copy with her because it's something that we all really sort of see as one of the fundamental priorities. The SEND improvement plan that we've just been talking about in answer to Mr. Clifton Brown's question has mental health as a fundamental, as one of the priorities there, because it recognises how mental health needs to be. Mental health support needs to be both integrated around a number of other of specifics of challenges, and include mental health, physical and mental conditions as well. So mental health is
so you have a written document that's
written through that document.
And just finally, do you think there's been any impact of long-term health conditions on attendance? For example, we know there's been a spike in eating disorders, long COVID, and have you done any assessment on that when looking at the attendance?
I think we're learning.
So the answer is not yet. I can paraphrase you because of time.
I mean, it's certainly true that when you look at the persistent absence figures, the biggest growth in persistent absence is illness related rather than unauthorised absence related. The persistent
some digging to be done underneath.
The persistent absence figures are a bit odd because they're percentage of possible school sessions missed, and what we've got at the moment is, for this year, is for the autumn term only. Now, there's quite a lot of illness going on, and because it's a percentage of the term, you only have to have missed 7 days to last term to have been classified as persistently absent, and quite a lot of people who got flu will have been off for 7 days.
Well, so the things have circulated because we were all locked up for 2 years and no one got anything.
Exactly. And so disentangling that from things that actually are
long-term
will just take us a little bit of time.
Okay, thank you, Ms Blake. We're going to move on. Just before we move on, though, you mentioned the Wellbeing Charter. In the evidence from the Children and Young People's Mental Health Coalition, they talked about the Wellbeing for Education Recovery Programme. Is that what's happened to that? Is that the same thing as the charter part of that?
The charter was specifically for teachers and leaders. No, the Wellbeing for Education programme was a set of investments around particular programmes.
And it was, so it's finished now.
From the first phase was in May 2021, where we invested £7 million, and then building on the success of £8 million that had gone before. So it was a specific level of investment for the last 2 years.
And have you evaluated that?
All of our programmes are evaluated, but I haven't got the evaluation.
If you would write to us with the evaluation of that, because
I will come back to you on
relatively in small, although it's a lot of money, it's relative. I mean,
we'll come back to you on that.
Be very angry if I say that's not very much money, but overall across the country, if that has achieved results, it would be interested to know what it achieved and why it's not continuing.
I can tell you it served about 14,000 schools and colleges, and it was principally about expert training and support and resources for staff in dealing with children.
I think we just need to see the
anxiety.
data about what it achieved for the money, because I think it's an interesting element to a much bigger problem. So we're going to move on to Jonathan Ginocchia MP.
Thank you, Chair. And if we can go on to managing the recovery programme. And I'm going to start off with paragraph 1.16 of the NAO report, where it says schools have not used all the recovery funding that DfE has made available. We estimate that by the end of the 2021-22 financial year, there was a 226 million, 14% underspend against the available funding. So perhaps to Mrs. Acland-Hood, why did schools not take up all of the funding?
So we recognise that figure, and that represents underspend on summer schools and on the tuition partner and academic mentor pillars of the programme. What it doesn't reflect, and this isn't because the NEO didn't do it right, is because we hadn't got far enough through to solidify the figures, is that we actually took some of that underspend on the tuition partners and academic mentor pillars and we fed it back into the school-led tutoring programme, because this relates to the year in which we saw lower numbers than expected on tuition partners and academic mentors, and then much higher numbers than expected on school-led tutoring, which is why, despite the underspend, we delivered the amount of tutoring we said we were going to deliver. So we hit the target for the amount of tutoring we were going to deliver.
Okay, and how does that move on into the 22-23 financial year? Will it even out as a result?
So, no, we will still see some underspend. So again, if I just take you through that. So the part of underspend that relates to the summer schools programme was partly about, so we made that money available as part of the recovery announcement, actually relatively close to the summer term in the end. And so we wanted to make sure money wasn't the limiting factor. So we made a lot of money available, and we assumed that schools might want to do 2-week summer school programmes, and we made enough money available effectively to cover the whole of the transition cohort going into Year 7. And what happened in practice was that although a very large number of schools took it up, not every school ran a summer school, and many of them ran 1 week rather than 2-week summer schools, and that's what drove the underspend. And there was also a bit of management of the figures. And then on NTP, again, when we moved to, so for the year in question, we saw that lower than expected demand on tuition partners and academic mentors, and higher than expected demand on school-led tutoring. And also school-led tutoring was cheaper than tuition partners and academic mentors. What you see for this year, which was reflected in our supplementary estimates, is that we're still seeing some schools delivering a bit cheaper than our funding rates, but we've also seen some schools delivering less tutoring than we made the money available for, and we've got a programme to talk to schools that aren't delivering tutoring. What we did was, through the school-led tutoring mechanism, was that we allocated money out to all schools based on pupil premium, on the assumption that that all of them would do tutoring for all of their pupil premium pupils. And so the mechanism was designed to make sure the money was out in schools and wasn't a barrier. But when you do it that way round, you do tend to find that not everyone will do it, and not everyone will do it to the extent that you expected. And so some money then comes back.
I wondered if I might just add one thing, which is that our target for tutoring overall was hit in that year. We reached and exceeded our near 2 million target. So it wasn't that we missed that metric.
Okay, so looking at school-led tutoring, in paragraph 221, the NO report says, DfE relies on schools to report how they have spent their funding allocation for school-led tutoring. If a school has provided fewer hours of tutoring than expected, or provided the expected number of hours but spent less than its funded allocation, the ESFA seeks to recover the overpayment by deducting it from future payments. So I think, to Ms. Archer, how much unspent money for school-led tutoring do you expect to recover from schools?
So, I mean, we are still going through that process, so I can't give you a figure for that. I think the supplementary estimates figure for this year suggests that we are expecting not to use 165 million of that funding. That's the best estimate I have at present. We are finalising that process of recovering from schools, and final figures obviously will come later and appear in our accounts.
When do the final figures come out?
In our accounts, departmental accounts.
When will that be?
Between the Parent Secretary and the National Audit Office.
Yes, it is.
July is the plan, isn't it?
July is the plan.
July.
They aim to see it back before the summer recess.
Okay.
Mr. Nogley.
So, in paragraph 2.8, it says, of the NAO report, it says, DfE intended that the recovery premium would help schools make up for lost teaching for disadvantaged pupils specifically. And I note that you've been talking about disadvantaged pupils, and I think you said there's been an increased take-up. But the NAO report points out that DfE have not routinely collected information on how schools have used the recovery premium. So, perhaps Mr. Archer, what assurance do you have that schools are using the recovery premium to support disadvantaged pupils specifically?
So, I think there are two or three things I would say in this space. The first goes back to the question of the extent to which we rely, and rightly rely, on schools and teachers to decide how best to use funding for their pupils. My second point would be that your interventions, and the interventions which work best for disadvantaged pupils, some of them, and tutoring is clearly an example of this, are sharply focused on those individual disadvantaged pupils. Some of them are about the nature of whole class teaching and the nature of teaching more generally. We have sharpened the way in which we expect schools to deliver the recovery premium in the same way that we have the pupil premium, through providing a list of EEF approved or EEF identified interventions which make a big difference. And we expect each year a school to provide a statement about how they have used their pupil premium in the broad, not for every individual pupil, but in the broad, and that includes the way in which they have used their recovery premium. And I think the funding itself, final point, is a really big signal. We have provided schools with recovery premium funding on the basis of the number of their pupils who are eligible for free school meals, and signalled very clearly that meeting that disadvantage gap is the purpose of that funding.
And I think you're doing a review of these recovery premium strategy statements, are you not?
We are indeed.
And when's that likely to be delivered?
The process is ongoing at the moment. I don't have the date for that in front of me, but I can certainly let you know.
Please. And are there issues coming out of that exercise that you'd like to tell the committee in terms of pointers?
Only in the sense that we see a variety of practice, we see a good deal of adherence to the EEF measures that they think are of critical importance. We see the balance that I've described between specific targeted interventions for individual pupils and for whole schools. But we will take that evidence and we will do what we've done throughout this programme, which is push back into the system where it seems to have been most effective.
If I may, one of the points that we are learning all the time is just how much the ambition of school leaders using EEF evidence, which is the gold standard evidence, how much of that has been followed. We see evidence that 70% of school leaders are following EEF evidence. One of the things I'm proudest of in terms of what we've done over the time that I've been here is the establishment of the EEF as that gold standard, and we re-endowed the EEF only last year for another 10 years. That's made such a difference in terms of the
Part of your legacy, Mr. McCully.
I do regard that as part of my legacy, and I'm really, really proud of the EEF's.
We do like it when people are proud of their public service.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. John Oakley. So over to Anne-Marie Morris, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Acland-Hood, what work has been done to try and compare how we have done in the UK as compared to other countries internationally similarly impacted by COVID? The start points, I think, were different, but I'd be interested to understand, particularly given that, whether or not the processes and systems, for example, the tutoring, that have been used here, were they mirrored abroad? Were there things that we saw going on abroad that we then said, that's a good idea, and brought that in, and has that given us a comparatively better outcome or worse outcome? I think right at the start you said nobody was predicting being able to fully close the gap, but nonetheless, how are we doing in terms of getting there and how we get there?
Yes, the gap I was talking about was the gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged overall. So we look a lot at the international evidence, and actually we spent quite a lot of time, and I might bring Mr. Archer in, who has our international function in his command. But and actually very early in the pandemic, I spent quite a lot of time talking to my counterparts around the world about what they were putting in place in order to make sure, exactly as you described, that we weren't missing things that people were doing. It is slightly complicated because the pandemic experiences around the world were quite profoundly different. So you see everything from...
So rather than just rather than differences, what lessons did you learn?
So there are some things we see... So versions of the recovery premium, in other words, additional money for schools to spend kind of basically
perhaps not rocket science that schools need money for catch-up.
That's very common, and we saw a lot of that around the world. Tutoring approaches we've actually had more people come to look at what we're doing on that and take it. So that there's been learning that way more, I would say, than in the other direction. The investment in teacher training and development, again, is something that we both see around the world, and that we have a lot of international partners coming to talk to us about, because of the work that we had already underway on the early career framework and national professional qualifications allowed us to go quite far and fast on that. And then you still see huge... And I mean, again, I was talking to Andrea Schleicher yesterday. We also try and use international comparative work to look at differential experiences, but again, a lot of the sort of headline conclusions are just that people were in very different circumstances and therefore have ended up in different places.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we learn more about we learn more from other systems in periods which are longer term and not interpolated and crisis management. So, you know, on pedagogy and on teacher training, we learn a lot over a long period from our partners. We host each year here an Education World Forum, which is one way in which we drive that. But we learned, I think, far more in those circumstances than we have from COVID, where circumstances were different. And as you say, Chair, not everything that was done was rocket science. Though some of it was undoubtedly useful.
The summary of your career, Mr. Archer, for decades.
One final question then, Mr. Archer, which is, given what you said, that everyone's starting in a slightly different place, and I know it's difficult, therefore, to compare. Are we doing better, worse, or on par with the speed of trying to, if you like, reduce that attainment gap?
Mr. Archer?
I don't think we have very clear comparisons. I would say we are, broadly comparable, rather than significantly ahead or significantly behind.
Some of this we won't know really until we see the impact on young people over the next decade. Indeed, so it's a very long. Thank you, Ms. Blake.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a few quick questions about the summer school programme and whether you felt that the purpose and impact of those programmes were what the DFE anticipated.
We've already had a little bit of an exchange about the funding. We didn't spend as much money as we had made available, and that's partly because of an ongoing and dynamic period of disruption. It's partly about us announcing that the funding was available close to the time, and it's partly about the way schools felt most able to use and best able to use the money. But 340,000 children benefited in 2,800 schools, and in terms of effectiveness, almost all those who expressed a view said that was effective in improving transition from primary to secondary. I mean, you would hope that was the case, wouldn't you? And about 73%, so 3/4, said it was also effective in improving well-being as part of that transition. So for that not at all insignificant, indeed rather large group of children, I think the summer school programme did what we had hoped and intended it would do.
Do you think if you were to do this again, you might not give the money directly to schools, but potentially a secondary provider?
My principle in most things is that schools is the place and are the people who are best able to determine what is best for their pupils. I think you need to be really clear, don't you, about who those providers might be and who those local partnerships might be, and we do rely in a number of ways on strong local partnerships to provide provision in partnership with schools, but I'm not sure that I think that taking away the funding or the the means to direct that funding is the way to best target pupil needs.
Just add to that. I think part of the purpose of the summer school programme was that focus on transition and recognising that there'd be particular challenges for pupils who missed out on the opportunities that they typically have to kind of visit schools they're going into in the term beforehand and so on. And I think with that transition aim in view, it would have been odd not to give the money to schools, because it's the school who can best support transition into itself, if that makes sense. I think it's worth remembering we were doing other things as well. So the holiday activities and food programme, for example, which provides activity support and good quality food for children from disadvantaged backgrounds in the summer holidays. I think in terms of the kind of long-term aim to address the summer learning loss we typically see more acutely among disadvantaged pupils, those kinds of programmes that make sure children are able to have the opportunity to be engaged in really good quality and purposeful activity over the summer in the way that their more advantaged counterparts may take for granted also have a really important role to play. But the summer schools was particularly about transition, and therefore I think it made sense to give money to schools.
Given transition is an issue every year, and that was quite an impressive percentage you gave then in your answer, Mr. Archer, do you think that this is something DfE would consider going forward?
I mean, we were in a very particular situation where children had missed out on the experiences that would normally lead them up to and into that transition. We had a piece of funding which was specifically for that purpose. So I don't think we would be replicating exactly the same thing. And as with all these sort of is future funding available conversations, that's very much a matter for the next spending review.
Absolutely. And then you won't be here to worry about that at that point. You could have just said yes and then even made Acland-Hood to but clearly you're still a professional civil servant rights here. Ms. Blake, any last quick... No, okay, we're going to turn that back to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Several quick questions with relatively short answers, please, because time is moving on. Given that exchange, firstly, you are to be congratulated as a department, I think, by the speed with which you actually did intervene with the National Tutor Programme. But given that exchange, why did you think that actually you were going to best be able to deliver this National Tutor Training Programme centrally through Ramstat, rather than delivered by schools? Obviously the teachers know best what is best for their pupils and children, and indeed who are the disadvantaged ones and who needs it most. Why did you ever think it was right to deliver it centrally?
So, I mean, my view is that there are three ways in which schools can best engage tutors, and I think all three of them are important and may benefit different pupils differentially. Now, those are using existing tutoring organisations, and obviously there is an existing tutoring market outside of the National Tutoring Programme. The second is bringing in new and trained and dedicated people to do tutoring. The third is using your own staff and local partners to deliver tutoring. And we began with the areas which most obviously put in additional resource and drew on existing capacity. And I think we did that successfully, in both the first and, notwithstanding some of the difficulties with Randstad performance the second year, we provided a great deal of support to schools through tutoring organisations and through what we called academic mentors, the centrally appointed and then pushed out to schools additional resource. And I think that worked well. We learned through the programme, as you would hope we would, firstly, that some pupils did not benefit from that. And the most obvious example of that perhaps is that a lot of pupils with special educational needs felt the need, were better being tutored by people they knew and people in schools. That's sort of one particular example, but many other examples about where tutoring from within the school was better. So we put alongside those other two methods a school, more directly school-led approach. That approach proved more popular, significantly more popular. So we switched our means of funding so that it was much more school-led, learning from the previous point, but still hoping, and indeed I think the fact is that schools are still using those three methods, and we have organisations who support schools with quality assurance, with training, so that whatever route tutoring is delivered by, it's delivered at really good quality. So, I think we've got benefit out of all three of those routes, and we've shifted, given the evidence in front of us of what's happening.
Much of the evidence in front of us, though, is very much focused on the school-led tutoring. But Sir Geoffrey, do you want to pick up?
So, Mr. Archer, why have 13% of schools not taken part at all in the National Tutoring Programme?
That remains, I think, for me at least, the biggest disappointment in the programme. I think schools will have, a range of different reasons for why they engage. Some of them will be about their view of the value of tutoring. Some of it will be about the process of engaging people to do tutoring. But what I can assure the committee is that we have put a good deal of resource and continue to put a good deal of resource into persuading those schools of the benefits of tutoring and seeking to reduce that number, both directly through phone calls and other contact, and through identifying what has worked really well and looking to use that to engage a wider group of schools.
So this is a little worrying going forward, but can I move to a slightly different issue with you, Mr. Archer? And this was raised to us by a number of colleagues, but Paul Howell, MP, the Member of Parliament for Sedgefield in particular. He says, my understanding from Action Tutoring is that the tutor subsidy is set to fall to 25% this year from its current rate of 60%. Given the challenges facing many schools, Action Tutoring has said this may put significant pressure on their activities. And this is the worry, is it not? That schools are increasingly being, the plans are there to carry on the National Tutor Training Programme, but schools are increasingly being asked to do it out of their own budget. Now, I know from my own constituency schools that they are having great difficulties meeting their budget. All the other things they've got to do, like mental health, we've discussed all of that, recruitment and so on. How are they going to actually do this?
So, the first thing to say is we've always been clear that the programme would taper in its share of the subsidy and has already begun that tapering process. I also think that if you want, as we do, tutoring to be a normal and embedded part of the school system, then it has to be funded through the normal school funding process. And our intention was both to support in a particularly difficult period post-COVID, but also to sell the benefits of tutoring to those schools who hadn't previously used it, and to show clearly the way in which that picked up on narrowing the disadvantage gap in particular. Going forward, and with the additional funding which has gone into the main school budgets this year, we do expect to see schools increasingly using their mainstream funding to do this and making it sustainable.
I understand that your wish to put it through the mainstream school funding, and that's fine if you actually do it. But if they don't have any actual extra funding, given them pressures on their budgets already, what it effectively will mean is that this National Tutor Training Programme will start to wither on the vine. And given the catch-up that is obviously still needed, particularly in disadvantaged children, surely this would not be the right thing to do.
Well, except that, what I think the programme has shown thus far is the value of tutoring as a specific intervention, and one that you would therefore want schools to use their existing budgets, their pupil premium.
But Mr. Archer, you misunderstood my question.
So Geoffrey,
I was not in any way questioning the value of the National Tutor Training Programme. We all admit that it's had huge value and still could have huge value. But if it isn't funded, with Ms. Acland-Hood, perhaps this is a question for you, because this is a high-level question on funding. Unless the schools are funded specifically for it, extra funding from what they're getting now, it is inevitably going to wither on the vine. And wouldn't that be the wrong thing to do, given the benefits we've already seen?
So I think there's two
the evidence is really clear on this from various parties.
I
they're very worried about.
I think there's three distinct things here. The first is, do we at some point want to mainstream this into core schools budgets? And if we want it to be a core feature of the system, we must do that. The second thing is, do you sort of almost then sort of soft ring fence a chunk of money and say this is for that and it's going to schools' budgets? And we tend to try not to do that, because actually what we want is schools making good allocative choices in their budgets. What we do want is schools to be sufficiently funded to do all the things they need to do for their pupils. We put an extra $2 billion into the system in the autumn statement this year. School funding overall this year is therefore going up by something of the order of $4 billion. And the pupil premium is there specifically for interventions targeted at individual pupils. One of the things we want to do through the National Tutoring Programme is demonstrate the value so people can think about the choices they make with the money they've got. And then the third point is about the taper of the subsidy and whether or not moving from 60% to 25% in a single year is too big a drop in order to achieve that end. And the committee the NAO report made a recommendation that we should model the impact of that shift in the subsidy, and we accepted that recommendation. We think it's really important that we do so. It is something that we have been we've had an eye on, because it clearly is a significant drop in the level of subsidy, and that is an action we'll be taking and discussing with our friends in the Treasury.
I hear what you're saying, Ms. Acland-Hood, and I accept those extra resources going into schools, but will you undertake today to keep monitoring this?
Yes.
And if there is a significant drop-off in tutor training, then you will look at this whole issue of funding again and see what more needs to be done. That's very, very helpful. Just one final point on this. This is again from Paul Howell. He says he understood that the NTP originally had targets of 65% pupil premium targets, but this has been removed.
Yeah, which we discussed a bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this again would seem to indicate that we're lessening the importance of pupil premium, those disadvantaged children.
It's again, we did touch on this briefly earlier.
Yes, we did.
So the target we set was when we had a national programme for Randstad. We thought that was important when we had a single national programme delivering, that they thought about how they were targeting to schools. What we now do is we allocate the funding to schools based on whether or not on the number of premium pupils they have. So we're achieving the same end through different means.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, I mean, but the evidence on the tutoring and the budget pressures. I mean, just let me say an example. Basically people saying they can't. I've got several job vacancies to support. They can't recruit. So even if they've got money to spend on tutoring, they're finding it hard to recruit people on that, but let alone the core stuff. So I think the basic funding issues in schools are is one of the big messages that came through in evidence, and from a range, as I say, of witnesses and members of Parliament. Over to Olivia Blake, MP.
Thank you. Just two questions on kind of spread and specific support. What extra support are you giving to children in the north of England, given the greater learning loss, Mr. McCully?
The very tilting of all the funding that we've been talking about by disadvantage means that actually it reaches and has focused those schools and indeed those areas with the greatest proportions of disadvantaged pupils. So that's not necessarily specifically the north, but actually in terms of the way in which the distribution of disadvantaged people, it means that it does do that, and at every level. So, for instance, even in the core school funding system, we have reviewed the factors and the national funding formula every year since its introduction, and this year it has been the biggest proportion of funding going into disadvantage, which has meant that the further distribution of or further orienting of funding benefits the north more than in the previous iterations of the funding formula.
So there's nothing specific in this programme?
Well, I would draw attention to the education investment areas. It was a key part of the school's white paper. So developed alongside of our work around the from education recovery, and those education investment areas have a sort of full representation in the north of England, and it's in those areas that we're sort of targeting our sort of key action on school improvement, for instance. It's in those areas where we have the targeting, in particular, the teacher recruitment premium that Susan mentioned a little ago, especially for those shortage subjects such as maths, physics, and computing. And in addition to those areas, we've got to those activities, we've got additional funding around some of the bespoke partnership activities. So the identification of those areas and the additional support going into those areas does benefit parts of the north of England.
And just very quickly on maths, given the ambitions of number 10, what specifically is going into pupils' catch up in maths?
Yes, well, maths of fundamental and extensive set of responses. I just highlight how much maths is a key part, and maths tuition is a key part of the national tutoring programme. If you look down the range of tutors and support, maths is by far the sort of the one of the sort of predominant uses of the national tutoring programme. I'd highlight the further extension of the maths hubs, now reaching very substantial numbers of schools, with the extension of our maths mastery approaches, based on the very best evidence from Shanghai in particular, which has, I think, been one of the fundamental changes in the way in which we teach maths in this country, and the benefit of that. I'd highlight the Accelerator Fund, which is part of the recovery package, and again, the demonstration of effective sort of maths teaching through the Accelerator Fund, particularly in mastering number, which has been a key part of the Maths Hub's activities, and outside the school programme, actually, into 16 to 19, again, key part of the education recovery area. And I think, given the future focus and current and future focus on maths, we are working even more on developing those approaches.
Great, thank you for that. Just to move on quickly, because I'm conscious of time. Without milestones, how are you going to track your that you're going to meet your attainment targets for 2030 even set out in the white paper for schools? Ms. Acland-Hood.
Or if McCully, working for your last 2 weeks.
I point to a number of things. First of all, we set out the sort of metrics and our measures in our department's operational plan that we publish. Clearly, the annual results from our tests and our GCSEs are sort of fundamental sort of moments of setting the progress levels, and the long-term ambition in the school's white paper obviously invites a recognition that of the importance of setting progress measures. We didn't do that in the school's white paper. We are looking to do that, and especially in so our plans for further reinforcing and implementing the school's white paper measures. And I expect to be able to share with the wider world, and indeed possibly even this committee, plans for primary within the next couple of months.
Okay. I mean, that would be very helpful. That kind of links to my next question, which is how will you keep Parliament updated on progress towards the ambitions of the white paper targets?
Well,
Ms Acland-Hood will be the one who's been doing it, so that's go to you, Ms Acland-Hood.
Yes, I mean, I think Mr McCully's covered quite a lot of that. So, I mean, we set those ambitious targets in the school's white paper at both Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, but every year in our outcome delivery plan, we publish actually a wider range of metrics at both Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4. We also publish the results of the Key Stage 1 test, the phonics screening check, the multiplications table check, and so on. And we use all of those to hold ourselves to account, and we expect other people to use them to hold us to account for progress.
Okay. Thank you. I've just got a question about the Performance and Risk Committee. How often will they be scrutinising the Education Recovery Programme?
So our performance, we have boards for each of the three main pieces of the department for skills, schools and families. And the schools board will look at this, meets monthly, and will, I mean, in effect, look at this every month because the business of education recovery is so closely entwined with the core business of the schools board, which is the progress that children are making in schools. So the schools board will look at it essentially every month. The Performance and Risk Committee, as I hope you would expect, takes a risk-based approach to what it looks at and focuses on making sure it's covered our top risks in rotation. So it's a bit difficult to predict exactly how often it would take this as a kind of core substantive item, but it'll look across the performance of the whole department in every meeting, so it does that quarterly.
And back to Mr McCully, I guess kind of be interesting to know what measures you would be reporting back to that committee, the Performance and Risk Committee, to show impact and that things are working or not.
And certainly against the some of the key inputs, we at the beginning of this discussion we talked about the sort of teacher quality improvements. So that at the moment is mostly important inputs. How many teachers, how many whether the sort of courses have been completed. So reporting on that regularly, but increasingly now that the accountability system and testing and GCSEs is back on stream. Obviously, having that as a regular piece, phonics screening check and multiplication table check are a number of the other inputs. The NAO in its recommendations encouraged the further development of longitudinal studies. That's a very good recommendation. We've had some of that in the past, and we've committed to investigate how we do that, and I would love to add that to the suite of information and reporting that we have to make sure that we're on track. So that's something as a result of the NAO report that we've committed to do.
That's reassuring to hear, and links to my next question, which is, in an ideal world, what data points would you like to have at your disposal to measure?
In that ideal world, it would certainly have some of that we don't have at the moment. We had more of that through very, very specific research pieces that we'd had during the COVID, working with organisations such as the Educational Policy Institute. And I think that is, as the NAO report identified, we can do better by returning and in expanding on that experience, and that's something where we've committed to do.
I mean, I'm heartened about the idea of longitudinal study because that's important, but I'm quite concerned in all what we've been hearing today that we've got a very urgent situation right now that was predictable during COVID, that we're going to have a problem, and yet there's going to be cohorts that will never get the benefit, as we've heard from evidence and we've heard indeed from you, of some of these supports, or not enough. Well, only 35% of schools taking up some of the programmes, schools finding it struggle to pay for others, cohorts going through won't have had the level of support because they identified exam pupils quite rightly on one level. There'll be a cohort that will lose out.
I mean, I think it's important to say that, I mean, the first announcements around investment in education recovery were made in June 2020, so that's pretty early in the pandemic.
I'm not suggesting that there wasn't work done. But it's not going to ever be enough, is it?
No. I mean, I think that is true, but I do think it is worth. Again, there's a bit of thanks to those in the system who've made this possible. But the longitudinal data we had during the pandemic showed that, I mean, particularly in primary, by autumn 2021, something like 2/3 of the learning lost by spring 2021 in primary reading had been caught up, and about half the learning lost in primary maths. Now that is quite rapid and quite a significant achievement. The challenge is always that the first bit, so there's this very typical pattern that the first bit of recovery is quick and then it slows. So there's something about continuing that investment. But I think the reach of the programmes has been something we've been really trying to focus on. And although Graham is ruthlessly chasing down the 13% of schools that haven't taken part in the national tutoring programme, it does leave the vast majority of schools in the country having.
But I think, one of
taken
the lessons come over though from all the evidence we've seen and from previous work we've done, that if you haven't got qualified teachers in the classroom, so you can't recruit teaching assistants, you can't pay for teaching assistants, then that will have a break on children's ongoing attainment, and that in catch-up is a very wicked issue, and Mr. McCully is nodding there. So.
We know that the single biggest contributor to children's education is a great teacher, which is why so much of the investment has gone into teacher education, and we completely appreciate the challenges of recruitment and retention. It probably is worth saying we do have more teachers, about 24,000 more teachers in the system than we had in 2010, and the largest number of teachers across the school system that we've ever had. So there are challenges, and there are there are challenges. There are particular challenges in recruiting to particular subjects, but we have seen a really significant growth in the overall teacher workforce.
I mean, certainly in London, pupils tell you. I mean, you speak to them, the heads tell you. A teacher leaves, and very often it's a non-specialist, and children are very aware when a non-specialist is teaching them. I'm surprised how not surprised, perhaps that's a bit patronising to teenagers. I don't mean it, but teenagers are very alert to having a non-specialist teacher. On which subjects, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown?
A very quick question to you, Mr. McCully. Given that the skills required for the tutoring programme are different from a general teaching skills. One, you're dealing with a class of 20 to 30 pupils. The other, you might be dealing on a one-to-one basis, or at least on a very small group. If we're not to see this NTP wither on the vine, which is I'm really concerned about, how are we going to create a sustainable market in tuition, and how are you going to assist teachers with that different skill set?
Quality is the watchword. And it is not just therefore about finding additional tutors, but through the sort of tuition partner route, important though that is, but also about the extent to which the effective practice and the use of the evidence about how effective tuition is delivered means that could be the most fundamental sort of legacy of the work that we've done so far, and the way in which embeds tutoring into the system for good. So I particularly point to the training that goes into all limbs of the national tutoring programme. The training that is, we have that quality assured and overseen by one of our contractual partners, EDT, but then underpinned by the research and the best practice. We talked about that earlier. That demonstrated by the EEF and NFER implementation evidence and research. So that for me is as important part of the sort of having a legacy of tutoring embedded permanently in the system, as it is about identifying additional organisations or additional tutors.
I'll just say one more thing about the training. So we've had about 20,000 people go through that dedicated training. We initially said that you must be trained if you were going to do tutoring as a teaching assistant in a school context, but you didn't have to be trained if you were already a qualified teacher, because we thought that struck the right amount. Interestingly, actually, most schools have put their qualified teachers through the training as well, and the feedback on the training has been extremely positive from both qualified teachers and teaching assistants. So there's a long-term legacy of having skilled more people in schools up to deliver that one-to-one and small group tutoring effectively, because as you say, the skills are different from whole class teaching.
Indeed, the training up of teaching assistants, again, I've seen so many potential exciting legacies of the work that we're doing. Having fundamentals of training offer and development for the teacher assistants.
And that's
who are
ongoing.
so
And that's going to be an ongoing programme. Okay,
Absolutely.
thank you. So Geoffrey.
You know, any analysis of that 20,000? What percentage of it is teachers and teaching assistants from the individual schools, and what percentage of it is teachers and other well-qualified people from outside the schools? Because presumably this is going to be delivered by not just teachers in the schools, it's going to be delivered by outsiders as well.
Indeed it is, and I don't have those figures, and well, we'll look to see whether we can provide the more specific those figures. But you're absolutely right that the typical school-led tuition is not just looking at teachers and teaching systems, but also retired teachers, and in some instances parents engage with the school as well.
Depends on the level.
Very helpful if we
Thank
can
you
have
very
that
much,
breakdown. Thank you.
Very quickly to Olivia.
Thank you, Chair. Miss Acland-Hood, how and when will we know whether the schemes for education recovery and the extra funding has delivered value for money?
So, I think we'll know different things about different parts of the programme at different times. So we've got evaluation wrapped around every element of the programme, and we're putting those out as we have them. So the evaluation we put out on the summer schools programme, which we quoted from, is already out there. For example, there's continuing evaluation of the national tutoring programme. But I think there are lots of extremely positive signs, including actually in the fact that we've delivered the amount of tutoring we said we wanted to deliver at somewhat lower cost than we initially thought it might take. So I think, I suspect this will be an ongoing exploration between us and the National Audit Office, but we will continue to put as much evidence out about the value for money of the work that we're doing as we can, as quickly as we have it.
Thank you.
And final one from me, Chair, Mr. Archer, what lessons have you learned from the first 2 years that you're going to apply to the next 2 years?
Or that not you necessarily, but you.
Well, exactly.
Pass them on.
People should.
So for me, it's about the power of data to help you target effectively to those pupils and places that need it most. And there's a powerful thing too about trusting schools and teachers and the great work that they do to drive the narrow, the sharp targeting on those pupils who need it most. So targeting in the broad and then targeting in the narrow, trusting schools and teachers to do a really good job as they do.
I think that's a wonderful note to finish on, because I think we would all say amen to that. Oh, and Sir Geoffrey's going to
I will go away from this session still quizzical if I don't ask this question, and it's a slightly different question. But what embedded lessons have we learned from the pandemic in terms of remote learning and rollout of the computer program and so on? There must be some very useful lessons that we've learned. What are they?
Yes, and I might bring others in on this as well. So I think I think we've learnt that remote learning is not a good substitute for a teacher. I think quite a lot of us probably thought that to start off with, but there was quite a lot of kind of in the ether about whether or not you were effectively going to
indication that some pupils found it a bit easier to speak online than
flip learning. True, but I think
overall...
I just focus your question, because it may be that some of this remote learning is useful in addition to in-class teaching, particularly for things like homework.
Yes, so that's what I was going to go on and say, actually. So I think we've learned a lot about using technology to support homework. I think we've learned actually quite a lot about using technology to support teachers in how they deliver learning. So there were some things where teachers were using more EdTech packages alongside the remote learning that allowed them, it actually goes back to Graham's point about targeting, to be able to see and understand the patterns of attainment among their pupils more clearly. And actually there's a programme of work we're now doing in the department. We've added education technology more clearly to the EEF's remit as part of its endowment, and we've got some work going on sort of following on from the legacy of the EdTech demonstrator pilot and some of the other things we do to look at exactly those lessons that have been learned, not just about remote learning, but about the use of technology in schools during the pandemic more widely. Plus, of course, remote parents' evening, which is everybody's favourite thing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Can I thank you all for your time? The transcript will be up on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. And again, thanks to Mr. McCully and Mr. Archer for their decades of service in the Department for Education. We hope you have a happy retirement.
Indeed.
Order.